Okay, so we're back and let's talk a little bit about operant conditioning. If you recall from our chapter on learning, operant conditioning is where we reward desirable behaviors and we punish undesirable behaviors. So how can we implement that in therapy? Now remember, for behaviorists, our goal is just to get you to stop doing undesirable behaviors, right? So the most obvious thing to do would be to punish undesirable behaviors. Here we have a little boy who's apparently a milkaholic, and so his every time he's looking at milk, his teacher's going to whack him upside the head with a book so that he'll stop thinking about milk or looking at milk or wanting to drink milk. That's aversive conditioning. Sometimes we use shock as the punishment, and so sometimes people think that it's always shock treatment. It's not. It's any outcome that the learner doesn't want to experience. So it could be a book upside your head. It could be a shock. It could be, if you're an addict, we could prescribe you Anabuse so that if you drink alcohol, you'll get violently ill. That's aversion therapy, where we're trying to get you to break the association, the pleasurable association between alcohol and social situations or whatever, so that maybe you can make a new association. So aversive conditioning, we're going to try and get rid of the undesirable behaviors by punishing them. Of course, one of the problems with this technique is that the learner figures out that the punishment is only going to be doled out by certain people or in certain circumstances. So like when this little boy looks at milk and that lady's not around, he knows he's safe, and so he can engage in his undesirable milk drinking behavior. An alcoholic who knows that if they skip their Anabuse, they can drink. They realize that in certain circumstances they get punished, but in other circumstances they don't. So they just avoid the behavior in the situations where they're likely to get punished, and they pursue the behavior in situations where they know they won't get punished. There was a controversial treatment for pedophiles that was tried in prisons, where they had pedophiles look at pictures of children while the pedophile's penis was attached to electrodes that was going to deliver a shock directly to the penis if it started to become erect. And the idea was that it would be so punishing that, one day we'd be able to release these guys back into the general population because they would have broken the association, right? But what happened instead is that the learner realized it's only dangerous when there's electrodes on my penis. I'm safe any other time. And so it really doesn't work. Instead, operant conditioning tends to focus on behavior modification. This is much more effective when we reward desirable behaviors. The idea in behavior modification is if we can keep you busy doing desirable behaviors, you won't have the time or the energy or the inclination to do the undesirable behaviors. So one thing we could do is a token economy. If we reward you outright every single time you do a desirable behavior, you might lose interest in the reward. You might get what we call satiation, and the reward loses its power. So what we could do instead is give you a token for every time you do a desirable behavior. Here's a reward chart you can buy off the internet and use on your child. You can see on the bottom it says this week's target is 17 stars and this week's reward is an ice cream cone. And then they've got all these activities. Say please and thank you, brush my teeth, do my homework, and so on. And for every day that they do their desired behavior, they get a token on the chart. At the end of the week, if they've accumulated 17, then they get their reward. This technique works really well in situations where the learner can't get access to the reward any other way except for through doing the desirable behaviors. So it works when you're a child, and parents dole out whatever the child gets to experience. It can work in schools where the kids don't have access to extra recess time or other kinds of rewards unless they do the desired behavior. It also works in mental institutions. I had a professor in graduate school who was a behavioral therapist, and he told us about a schizophrenic who was in the mental hospital, and he was having delusions and hallucinations so frequently that he pretty much was just always in his own world. No one else could interact with him or have any kind of productive therapy going on with him, things like that. So this professor said, well, let's try a token economy on him. They figured out what was really rewarding for this learner, which is really important. You got to figure out what the learner values enough to work for. And so they figured out that this particular patient valued controlling the television set in the communal area. And so for every 15 minutes that he went without a hallucination or a delusion, they would give him a token. And if he accumulated adequate tokens, then he would get half an hour of controlling the channel on the TV set. And he was willing to work for that. And the therapist said, the professor said that over time he wasn't displaying delusions or hallucinations at all. So it seems to have worked. The question that came to all of our minds, and probably is coming to your mind, is, well, was he not having delusions and hallucinations, or was he just not saying anything about them? That's what we asked. And the professor said, it doesn't matter whether he was having them or not. What matters is that he was behaving in a way that was more normal and rational and allowed other people to be around him and stuff like that. He wasn't freaking out and things like that. So again, remember that behavioral therapy is targeting undesirable behaviors, and we don't care what's going on inside your head, what motivated the behaviors in the first place, whether you still want to be doing the behaviors or not. We don't really care. All we know is that you're not doing the behavior that we don't want you to be doing. In autism, we oftentimes are trying to encourage behaviors that the autistic person doesn't naturally display, like eye contact, like showing an interest in other people's behaviors or likes and dislikes, stuff like that. So you can use a behavior modification technique where you reward them for displaying those kinds of behaviors. And then you can ignore them is the best strategy they've found. Ignore the undesirable behaviors, like these automatic behaviors that they do where they rock or beat their head on the wall or something like that. Ignore that. Reward desirable behaviors. Reward them when they stop doing that behavior so that they realize not doing the repetitive behavior gets me a token. Doing the repetitive behavior, I get ignored. And it seems to work pretty well. It doesn't cure autism, but it causes them to develop some behaviors that can make it easier for other people to interact with them. Now, cognitive therapy sprung out of behaviorism, and in fact, in our textbook, I think they call it cognitive behavioral therapy. In cognitive therapy, the goal is to get you to change your thinking style, the thinking that might be contributing to depressed symptoms or anxiety. So the technique that's usually used is called rational emotive therapy. A lot of people who go into therapy and have this kind of treatment respond really well to the structure of the therapy because it oftentimes sends you home with homework, things to work on, things to try out, things like that. And people really respond positively to it because it feels like they're doing something constructive towards their own improved symptoms. Now, the mindset behind cognitive therapy is that, it's at that internal belief stage where you're showing errors. Remember, we talked about in the last chapter the idea that maybe a person becomes depressed or anxious when they mislabel an outcome. They're like, I lost my job because I'm worthless. That's an internal attribution, right, where you're blaming yourself. Or it's hopeless. That's a stable attribution. It's always going to be like this. It's never going to get better, right? So when you have a lost job and then you have those kind of pessimistic, internal, stable, global attributions, according to this technique, that's what leads to depression. So according to this technique, we're going to try and switch those internal beliefs. We're going to try and get you to stop thinking so emotionally and instead think rationally about the situation. So when you lose your job, maybe you should, instead of thinking I'm worthless, you should think to yourself, you know what, that boss was a jerk anyway. Or instead of thinking it's hopeless, maybe I should recast it into, you know what, I deserved something better anyway. This is the impetus that I needed to get off my, secure little, couch and go do something else. With those kind of recast internal beliefs where it's temporary, it's external, it's specific to the circumstance, you're much less likely to develop depression. So in this therapeutic technique, we're going to try and get you to think like a non-depressed person. Whether you really feel those things or not is another issue, but we're going to try and get you to think and attribute outcomes the way that a non-depressed person would. And it tends to reduce depression. In fact, of the talking therapies, of the psychological therapies that I've discussed, cognitive therapy is the most effective treatment for depression and for anxiety. So this is the best way to go if this is what your symptoms, if you have these kinds of disorders. Recast the way that you think about things. Now, there are other techniques, other popular therapies, and the textbook has like a paragraph or two on each of these types, and they are what they sound like. Bring your family in and work on the whole unit, because maybe this is maybe it's not just the patient or the client who has an issue. Maybe it's the situation in which they dwell with their family. Group therapy is where you get a bunch of different people who have the same disorder together, and everybody gets therapy at the same time, and they not only benefit from having the therapist or the counselor there, they also benefit from what they're hearing from each other. And then self-help groups, you don't have any therapist involved, but instead you have a bunch of people who either are trying to live with something that they have, wrong with just in their own lives, or it could be that they have a loved one. I mean, this self-help groups are things like Alcoholics Anonymous, or the families of alcoholics have their own support groups. So that's the idea. If you have a child who's autistic, you could join a self-help group. There's all sorts of groups like that to help each other to cope with challenging situations. So there's other kinds of therapies available. I didn't want to bog down too much on those, and our textbook doesn't either. If you find this stuff interesting, by the way, you can always take Abnormal Psych. It goes into all this stuff in a lot more detail. All right, so which psychotherapies work best? Well, it really depends on what disorder you're talking about. For depression, cognitive behavioral therapy works the best. Psychodynamic theory is starting to make a resurgence for the treatment of depression, and it also seems to be working pretty well for anxiety. So cognitive behavioral, psychodynamic for depression or anxiety, and then exposure therapy also works well for anxiety. Phobias work really well with exposure therapy and behavior conditioning, and then a different thing that I threw in here because this is something that can be treated really well with behavior conditioning. So it really depends on what disorder a person has, what kind of technique they should seek out. I'd also like to point out, if you're ever looking for a therapist, every therapist has their own technique, their own style, and they have their own personality. So if you're ever looking for a therapist, you need to do it like you would be searching for anybody who you're going to have to be talking to for, hours on end in your life, right? You want to make sure that you guys have similar styles, that the person doesn't make you feel like you're being judged or makes you feel uncomfortable or something like that. You have to have a match for your symptoms and then their technique, and then also between your personality type and their personality type. So sometimes it takes a little bit of searching around and interviewing and getting like a sample session with them to find out whether you guys mesh or not. Not everybody meshes with every therapist. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll come back and we'll shift over to biomedical therapy techniques.